Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to invite all of the panelists here to turn on your videos, and we're going to get started as people continue to trickle in. Um, Rubia, if you could please go to the next slide, and I'll use that as a way to introduce everyone. So we're here today to talk about the impact that the EU textile strategy will have on apparel suppliers. But it should be, what I want to explain is that this session is part of a much larger piece of work. In July, we launched the second iteration of our Apparel Suppliers Guide to Sustainability Legislation in the US, UK, and EU. And that resource has a number of fact sheets, which will be explained later, but one of them is on the strategy. So today's session is a deep dive into that EU strategy. But before we go there, what I would also like to share is that resource has a lot of different, is really a co-created initiative. There are a lot of different people who have put in a lot of different types of work and resources to make this happen. And so I'd like to introduce them and acknowledge them first. So the resource was commissioned and led by Crystal Group. And from Crystal Group today, we have Kyle and Cami. It was also led by Diamond Fabrics Limited, which is part of Sapphire Group in Pakistan. Lenzing, Pactics Group in Cambodia, Poetic Gem, which is from Poetic Gem, we have Kavita, and she's going to be, you'll be primarily hearing from Kavita today, but not exclusively hearing from Kavita. Shahi Exports, and from Shahi, we have Gauri Sharma. And Simple Approach, which like Poetic Gem is also part of PDS Group, and Sourcery. And from Sourcery, we have here Ruchita and Amelia. So it was all that to say that this was an initiative that was really led by quite a lot of people and by the supply chain itself. It was also supported by Transformers Foundation. And I'm here today on behalf of Transformers Foundation. So Transformers Foundation works with the denim supply chain and strives to put forward its ideas on positive change in the sector, and also GIZ Fabric. And from GIZ Fabric, we have Tia Churnside here today. So that's why you have all of these speakers in front of you, because this project really was an initiative that was came to life through the efforts of a lot of different people. The Remedy Project is also here with us today. And the Remedy Project is the legal team that actually wrote the report. And so the report was very much, the Remedy Project would tell us, what a particular piece of legislation said. And then the suppliers on this leading this work would say, okay, but what might that mean actually for us in our factory? And so in that sense, the guide itself was really an iterative and co-created process that involved quite a lot of back and forth between sort of people who knew supply chains and people who understand the law. The last thing I want to say is, and I mentioned that Kavita, you'll be primarily hearing from Kavita today. So what we're going to do today is the Remedy Project is going to give a short presentation which dives into, well, what does the EU textile strategy actually say? Then we're going to do a conversation between the Remedy Project and Kavita. So, okay, this is what the legal text says, but what will it actually mean for suppliers? And there'll be a little bit of exchange on that. And Kavita is really speaking on behalf of the group of suppliers who led this work. It's not practical to have a conversation with all of these different people. And so she's going to be leading this one, but in future webinars, you'll probably hear from other suppliers who were involved in this work. And then we'll open up for audience Q&A. And we'll invite you guys to share your questions. And I encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A as we go along. You may also hear from some of the other suppliers on the call during the Q&A, depending on what the question is. Rubia, next slide. Thank you. And the last thing well, no, not quite last, but the other thing I want to highlight before I hand over to the Remedy Project is why we created this resource. We've been, to be honest, overwhelmed by the support and interest in this guide. And it was created to support suppliers, mostly operating outside of the global north, to better understand how recent and upcoming sustainability-related legislation in the global north will impact them. And the report really is the first of its kind. As I've said already, it was a supplier-led public policy resource for suppliers. So for suppliers, by suppliers. And we hope that it will build and encourage more supplier collaboration within the policy space. Rubia, next slide, please. Before I hand over, last thing before I hand over to the Remedy Project, if you want to download the report, there's a QR code there. If you want to support future iterations of this work, I mentioned that we're now on our second version. The policy space is changing all the time. So this document is always in need of updates, and there's always more pieces of legislation that we could cover. So if you're interested in supporting future fact sheets, we would also love to hear from you. And there's a QR code on the screen for that. And then the last thing is that this is the first, this webinar today is focused on the EU textile strategy, but we're going to be doing a series of webinars on different pieces of legislation featured and covered in the guide. And so if you'd like to register for the next one, it's on the 5th of November, and that one will cover the CSDDD and the German Supply Chain Act. With that, I am going to hand over to the Remedy Project, to Archana and Veronica. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Kim, and thanks to the Transformers Foundation for this opportunity to be here. It was our first time certainly being involved in a project that was for suppliers and led by suppliers, and what a learning it has been. I guess from our perspectives as an organization that works a lot with brands, with civil society, and now increasingly with suppliers, we are primarily seeing a huge wave of legislation sweeping through buyer markets. These are coming out of Europe, they're coming out of Australia, they're coming out of the United States, Canada, and various other countries globally. Primarily, these are laws and strategies that are really aimed at putting people and planet first. So they're encouraging and inviting businesses who are affected directly by these laws, primarily the brands and buyers that you're working with, and who are based in these locations, to really think about what adverse impact is business having on people and on the environment. So in the series of webinars that we are going to be looking at, and you will also note in the resource, the report that Kim mentioned earlier, we look at legislation and strategies that cover not just the impact on human rights, but also the impact on the environment, including things like eco-design and also the strategy that we'll be talking about today. It is the brands that are in scope. However, suppliers will also experience the impact indirectly. For brands to comply, they will be relying on suppliers to provide more disclosures, to perhaps change their policies and processes in order for the brands to fall into compliance. So there is a big need for suppliers to truly understand what the buyer expectations and obligations are, but also what the intention of the legislators is behind all of these laws. So one thing that doesn't come across in practice is that many of these laws intend for there to be a shared responsibility across the value chain. What that basically means is just because a brand is in scope or the law applies to the brand and it has to comply, doesn't mean that it then gets to pass on the responsibility to suppliers. However, in practice, this is what we see happening. Whether it is increased disclosures, whether it's a bulked up code of conduct that the supplier now has to abide by, or whether it's a requirement for more transparency, more procedures, different industrial processes that manage waste and other resources differently, these are all being passed down the value chain to suppliers. And the cost of doing business isn't reflective of many of these changes that are taking place. So from a supplier's perspective, there's clearly a need to understand where are the opportunities to push back, to come back to the negotiating table when it comes to these legislation. And also, it requires an investment by suppliers into the future of their business. Not easy, but absolutely necessary. If I was to leave you with one thought, it would be this: risk to people and planet is the biggest risk to business. And that's the essence, and that's the gist of where all of these legal strategies are going to. Next slide, please. So the guide that Kim mentioned is an apparel supplier guide. And the idea is to just help suppliers really break down and understand across 13 pieces of legislative initiative what is the impact for the brand that is in scope of the law, and how is that likely to impact the suppliers, albeit indirectly? And how can suppliers then go about thinking of responding or rising to this challenge, which implies not just, investment in resources, but also investment in time and perhaps investment in business in a way that has not been required up to date. There are 13 pieces of legislation, and these cover human rights and the environment. And this does not constitute legal advice. So the idea is to just really help you, supplier, to prepare for what is coming down the pipeline or what is already in force. And the key sections that I'd really like to draw your attention to are: what is the current status of this piece of legislation? Has it already come into force? Is it going to be coming into force in a phased manner? What does that look like? What are the obligations for brands, and what are the potential implications for suppliers as well? And that is absolutely critical. So that gives you a little bit of a backdrop for the conversation we're going to have today, which is very much focused on the EU strategy. And I'll hand over to my colleague Veronica to take it from here.
Thank you, Archana. If we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So going into the topic of today's webinar, the EU strategy for sustainable and circular textile. It is a strategy that it is not binding in itself, but it sets out the intention for developing binding legislation. The objectives of this strategy are to promote the use of sustainable textiles that are durable and easier to repair and reuse, to create circularity models for reuse, repair, and recycle to maximize resources and to minimize waste, and to address issues of labor rights and working conditions in global supply chains by conducting environmental and social due diligence. Next slide, please. So these objectives are reflected in the 4 laws that are developed based on the strategy. At the moment, only the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Regulation is in force, and the other 3 laws are still work in progress and may be adopted in the following months. What do these laws prescribe? First, the Eco-Design Regulation that design requirements to ensure that textiles use less energy and water for production, can be easily disassembled and reused, do not contain substances that prevent the product from being recycled, and has a lower carbon footprint over its life cycle. Second, the Directive on Green Claims makes sure that everything that a company claims about their sustainability measures can be verified. Third, the revision of the Waste Framework Directive places responsibility on brands and suppliers for covering the cost of managing textile waste. And lastly, the revision of the Textile Labeling Regulation introduces specific sustainability and circularity parameters to write on the digital and physical labels of the product. More legislative developments can be developed based on this strategy and may be developed in the following months. So, in terms of the consequences of this strategy on suppliers, As Archana was saying, brands will likely be in scope of these laws and will turn to suppliers for support in complying with these laws. This is why it is relevant for suppliers. Even though it is unlikely that suppliers will be directly in scope, they will be required by brands to indirectly comply with these requirements and to change the way they do business and to disclose data on how they're doing it. If we can move to the next slide, please. So what are these requirements? First, to innovate their products and to use textiles that are more sustainable. And this means not only textiles that have a lower impact on the environment, but also a lower impact on workers and the communities where these textiles are sourced from. Second, to write on the labels of your products the durability of the textiles, the repairability, the environmental footprint for producing it, and other relevant sustainability and circularity parameters. Third, suppliers will be considered responsible for the entire life cycle of their products, and they will pay a fee for disposing textile waste that is calculated also according to environmental standards. This basically means that producers of products that are harder to recycle will pay a higher fee, and producers of products that have products that are easier to recycle will be charged a lower fee. Lastly, the digital product passport is a requirement set by the eco-design regulation. It means that every product will have a passport telling the journey of the product on how it is made, how it is produced. And such information will be useful for consumers in deciding whether to buy that product or not, and also to increase transparency on what happens in the supply chain. And speaking of the consequences, Kavita, what are your thoughts on the likely impact of the strategy on apparel suppliers?
Oh, Kavita, you're muted.
Sorry. Nice to be here. I think a couple of important points which have come through, from all the suppliers who are experiencing the impacts also here, is cost. So the resources that you need to put in to comply with these or to support your brands to comply with this means resource investment. So there is cost. And I think collaboration then is going to become really key. And support from your brands will become really crucial. So I think we would suggest that if you're not having conversations with your brands already about this, you need to start having those because there has to be a collaborative effort between brands. You cannot shift responsibility from one to the other, especially from brands to suppliers, which we see is happening. Suppliers also will need to ensure that they have access to legal support in their business, and the financial teams are well versed in all of this, just as much as the commercial and design and technical teams need to be. Besides that, in the day-to-day methodologies that we use, to serve our customers, suppliers will now need to ensure that they have complete visibility of their supply chain, down to the raw materials. And beyond that, they need to know and prove the sustainability of their materials. The ethical credentials of both their materials, including waste, the end-of-life recyclability, and the supply chain facilities, and then prove also the chemical and the environmental impacts of their materials, and ensure that these comply with the legislations in terms of impacts, which you just heard of from Veronica. To be able to deliver all this, suppliers will need to ensure that they have all the data in place. So you need to be ready with accessible data, able to recall the data in whichever format needed based on requirements of the framework and the requirements of the customers and brands. Because what we are seeing is a lot of brands are going to come to suppliers with possibly different formats for the same data with ever so slight difference is that there's going to be a lot of additional work unless brands are going to collaborate and look at one way of doing things, which isn't going to happen for a while. This means digitization is going to be key. To be able to begin to manage materials and the supply chain, the externalities and the direct impacts, and the mitigation strategies. As suppliers, we will also need to be sure we have those in place. Apparel suppliers will also need to become conversant with legislations, even as they emerge and develop. And this effort, this collective has put together this report in an effort to enable that. Some are already legally binding, and due diligence in every aspect, as well as proper remedial mechanisms, because some legislations demand that. That's going to be a need. So these need to be in place, especially for social and environmental impacts and the legislations associated with that. For example, the EPR, the waste management, or Green Claims Directive, the DPP, which Veronica just spoke about. Circularity and circular design, and the DPP, these are the two directions of travel. So transparency, visibility for your end customer as well. These are already here. As suppliers, we need to be comfortable with these, and we need to be ready with these. Kim, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, actually, I'm going to pass it back to Veronica. And Veronica, I'd love to get your take, I mean, on what you see as the, from a legal perspective, the consequence on suppliers. And also, I see there's some questions in the chat already, and we're not in the Q&A section yet, but I'm going to flag them because they might be relevant to some of what you're going to share. So there are a couple of questions specifically on, which data is going to be required for different pieces of legislation, which I know is a very specific question. And also the skills that might be suppliers should maybe have in-house to prepare. But okay, Veronica, from a legal perspective, what are the consequences of this strategy on suppliers?
So the consequences and the measures that suppliers can put in place to actually deal with these potential implications are the following. First, as Kavita mentioned, it is important to have visibility on what happens in their supply chain. This means that suppliers should map their supply chain and understand who are the actors involved, where do they work, how do they work, and to set up a system to collect this data and analyze them. And this will be useful for suppliers, but it will also be useful for brands in case they ask for disclosure. Suppliers should also identify and address the human rights and environmental risks in their business operations and in their supply chain. So they should engage directly with the people impacted by their business operations to better understand the impacts. And they should have a risk management in place to prevent and minimize such risks. It is also important, as we were saying before, to implement measures to minimize production of waste, investing in durable and sustainable textiles like renewable and recycled materials, and investing in take-back programs where consumers can bring back the products that they do not want anymore, and producers can reuse the materials. In the future, compliance with these requirements may become a prerequisite for accessing the market. So I would like to ask Kavita, as suppliers will need to implement these measures, what do you think will be the main challenges for implementation?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges, which I touched upon earlier, would be the different ways of working and different ways of implementing by different customers or key brands. That's going to be a big one, because that's going to bring a tsunami of requests to suppliers for data or for implementing certain ways of working even. The costs, again, the resources, whether it's people, whether it's software, it's data gathering, so there's going to have to be greater interaction with your supply chains. Legal support is something which, if it's not in place, that needs to be in place. Certifications for facilities, for materials, for better waste management methodologies, which means measuring your waste, which is one of the challenges, that simple but one key challenge. And then compliance, chemical compliance, whether due diligence compliance, chain of custody, and all of that, and all of these other requirements. The danger of the possible shifting of responsibility towards the suppliers, although there are legislations in the next webinars about the CSDDD, which are trying to mitigate this. And the sheer complexity of not well understood legislations. Again, this is an effort to help support with that, this whole report and this webinar. And the challenge is due to the lack of data in one place. I think this is one practical challenge that everybody speaks to. Everybody is in the same place. So if you are in this place where you find that you got the data, it's sitting in silos, or you have data on Excel sheets, don't have proper PL systems yet, you're not the only ones. So data needs to move towards complete digitization and be easily accessible. This is a huge challenge. Chain of custody, paper trails, certifications for compliance, to ensure compliance, they need to be in place, and everybody needs to understand how to ensure that these are valid certifications, how to read these certifications, how to fact check them, to how to be sure that the certifications you're offering your customers are actually valid and true, and not, sometimes they are not the right ones. So you need to be completely conversant with all of that. And last but not the least is the future of material scarcity, resource scarcity. And one example would be everybody trying to produce recycled polyester, for example. Where's that going to come from in the long run? There's already been challenges with people converting bottles, virgin bottles, into recycled polyester. So that's a huge thing. Water scarcity will feed into this, because you're going to have resource scarcity for farm-based materials, or land scarcity. So there's capital scarcity, there's natural capital scarcity. So all of that is going to be a huge challenge, not only for suppliers, but also for the customers. So that can be a big one.
Thank you, Kavita. I maybe will just add here, because I know, as a result of this guide, like, we've had a lot of conversations with different suppliers on this point, and I see that there's a lot of questions in the chat also related to the digital product passport. And this is kind of, I think, related. I think the number of questions in the chat, in the Q&A about the digital product passport sort of speak to this, which is that I think suppliers are the ones that are subsidizing not only the industry itself, but also sustainability. And what I mean by that, and I think that's why we're getting all of these questions on the digital product passport in the Q&A, is they're the ones who have to pay for the data platforms. They are the ones who have to pay for the people to collect that data. They are the ones who then also pay for the products stuck in customs when there's a problem, usually. And this is in a context where the risk and reward is already not shared in a way that is equitable relative to the margins that each actor along the value chain is making. And so I think I'm very curious to hear from the Remedy Project, and then we'll come to the questions in the Q&A, but I'm very curious to hear from the Remedy Project, what can suppliers, and you said it at the beginning of your presentation, the intention, the legal intent of this strategy is shared responsibility, but in practice, that doesn't seem to be playing out. Kavita just, I think, gave a number of examples of how it's playing out in real life. And so what can suppliers do to actually approach compliance and also ensure that this responsibility is a little bit more shared?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. And very, very topical and very important. I mean, if I was to say one way to think about and to conceptualize all of what is going on, including this strategy and this strategy placed within a much bigger framework, it falls on three pillars. One is transparency. So there's a lot more reporting requirements now, including in the form of DPPs, so the passport. We see this in other legislation as well, for example, relating to batteries. So it's a common theme. How has this product fared, travel, originated, etc.? And with that, there's an enhanced requirement around transparency across the supply chain. The second thing is accountability. So we start seeing, companies being held accountable for the types of risk and data management systems that they have. How good is your system? Is it congruent with your footprint? Is it congruent with the complexity of your operation, etc.? These are all requirements on brands, but the brands are unable to fulfill this on their own, so they start looking towards suppliers. And the third is sanctions. So there's legislation emerging around sanctions. So if you're unable to be transparent and accountable, then there are sanctions that kick in. So the important thing to do is to firstly acknowledge that there is this risk and that this burden is shifting and has shifted and is likely to continue to shift. And even though we are seeing legislation, for example, CSDDD is very clear that suppliers must not be shouldering the cost of compliance, and that there has to be a degree of sharing which is a lot more equitable across the value chain. CSDDD actually goes a step further and really spells out that when it comes to SMEs, there needs to be financial and non-financial support provided. If suppliers are being asked to create systems, policies, and processes, then this needs to be reflected in a newly discussed purchase price. There needs to be separate provision made for contractual assurances where it is very clear from the outset what are going to be the requirements on suppliers and what is the true cost of that. In one of the factors that legislators look at, they really look at what does the relationship between the brand and the supplier look like? What is the bargaining power? Where are the requirements sitting? Is it primarily with the supplier? Is it primarily on the supplier to develop a grievance mechanism to then start sharing data with the brand? Or is the brand offering some kind of support because the supplier is simply unable to create and to run such a system based on their current resources? The second thing is, pushing back on compliance costs. Brands in scope need to be bearing the cost and shouldering a significant amount of that cost. So you're not, you are well within your rights to be pushing back on those. Working constructively as well and partnering with brands to seek the support because they are unable to secure compliance and to be able to comply and provide the data that the regulators want to see without your cooperation and your support. So you're not in that position where you're having to surrender. Actually, they need you. And they need you, and that needs to be reflected in a much more collaborative approach. And seeking opportunities to initiate dialogue around changing practices. So opportunities to talk about what would a different contract look like? What would a purchase price look like? In my area of work, for example, we see very often that brands lean on suppliers to pay recruitment fees back to migrant workers. One of the conversations we are having right now is why wouldn't the purchase price be reflective of the labor costs of the supplier? And that would include the fact that the employer now has to pay for the recruitment fee. So you really start to see how these conversations need to start percolating and happening now because the burden is transferring as it is. The one final point I do want to make is it's really important for suppliers to align and to work collectively. This is a case of there is power in numbers. So get behind your industry associations and get organized, because you're going to need all the firepower that you can have as a collective in addressing some of these significant challenges that are affecting the industry. And ask for support from your industry association. They're there to also serve you, and it's really important that industry associations are also able to help coalesce and structure suppliers, particularly around what are considered to be key gaps in terms of knowledge and infrastructure. In my line of work, for example, we see grievance mechanisms is one of those. Access to remedy and remediation is one of those. Due diligence procedures, risk identification and management procedures is another one of those. So there is a lot to be gained here by joining forces and by creating infrastructure and knowledge that can be shared across different supply levels. So I'll pause there, Kim. I know there are a lot of questions. Back to you.
Yeah, and I thank you, Archana, because I think for me, this is like one of the most the things that makes me the most hopeful is, we see in practice that shared responsibility, even though it's the legal intent, is not playing out. There are places within this legislation to or there's opportunity within the legislation to sort of try and push back on that a little bit. You've just given some examples of how you might do that in terms of like having conversations with customers about costs, about engaging with brands on asking and for financial support, but also price. And then an opportunity to initiate conversations on purchasing practices. But I have to say, like, as a former garment factory manager myself, this all sounds great, but would I ever have actually been able to have that conversation with my customers? No. So I want to turn to Kavita briefly and have you respond. I mean, how do these suggestions sound to you? And have you heard of any suppliers trying to engage with their customers in this kind of way? And has it worked, or how have they done that?
I think this is a tough one. It is really hard for suppliers to turn around and tell their customer, no, we aren't going to be doing this for you, because customers will turn around and tell you, well, other suppliers are doing it for me. Whether that's true or not, it is pressure, So I think one way of getting around it, which I've seen work in the past, is a collaborative approach with your counterparts in the brands. For example, the sustainability leadership in the brands and your C-suite or your sustainability leadership having honest conversations with each other, where there's an example where we had a conversation with our customers where our senior leadership in sustainability said to their counterparts, why don't you introduce KPIs for your buyers, which include sustainability in there, whether it's buying practices and things, and gave examples of how they'd done it in the past, and it really changed the conversation. So that was very well received, because sustainability professionals sitting on both ends of the equation are usually guided by a desire to really make good change happen. And sometimes those kinds of conversations are easier had with them if they hold influence in their company. So that's one thing. Your CRMs maybe are able to have a more honest conversation with your commercial counterparts on the other side. So it maybe, approach where there's a comfort between those sort of players helps. It has worked in the past. So that's one suggestion. The logical conclusion, of course, is in terms of knowing where you are and where you want to get, and then approaching the challenge. So
Thank you, Kavita. Yeah. Oh, sorry, was there more you wanted to say?
Yeah, Just about, tackle your low-hanging fruits first. That was one tip.
All right. Thank you. Archana and Kavita, is there anything else that you'd really like to say, or can we move into the Q&A?
I have a couple of points
Okay.
which I've made earlier, but again, I just want to reiterate on the data bit. The data, when the data is available and it's accessible, it is going to make everybody's lives a lot easier. So I would say, within your business as suppliers, need to have those conversations with your C-suite and start looking at things like IT resources. Do you have within your company, or do you need to engage with some? Are you building your own PLM platforms? Are you buying some off-the-shelf solutions? Maybe have conversations with other suppliers pre-competitively. It could help to get some tips there, and ensure that you know your keychain suppliers, your key materials, your certifications. I'm just reiterating points I've already made, because transparency, visibility is really important. And look deeper into your waste management, emissions strategy. Carbon emissions is one big thing that is going to come in. So look into that, and the hard conversations, even within your business, to have them with your senior leadership. But you will find some players who understand, who get it, leverage those conversations and those relationships and try and make it interesting, keep conversations short, and simple, so people are able to sort of come on board. Once you've got the hook in there, then you'll be able to bring them on board and use, in terms of actual material usage, try and use the best materials you can afford to offer your customers with full chain of custody, because that is what is going to now power your data and your reportings. And look at things like aligning with the Science-Based Target Initiative, for your greenhouse gas emissions and things. That is one of the biggest things that your customers are going to come and ask for. That's it.
And Kim, I'll just add very quickly, I understand the skepticism around bringing people back to the negotiating table, but I would like to suggest that we are entering very different times to where we've been before, both in terms of the legislative framework, the pressures on brand to deliver in a way that requires the collaboration and the support of suppliers as never before. So I would like to suggest that as we enter into this new space of enhanced regulatory pressure, there is an opportunity here, and that opportunity must be taken. And the first step to taking that opportunity is to really acknowledge the risk, to understand where the openings are, which is the point of doing this series of webinars and creating the guide, and to start finding common strands in conversation and pick the low-hanging fruit, as Kavita says. My first engagement with suppliers about 2-3 years ago was when a brand actually paid for and supported my work in helping them to develop a grievance mechanism. Because the brand realized that by working with a supplier that had no grievance mechanism, it was a problem for their own risk management. So they then decided through a bunch of conversations that this was something they could look at supporting and developing. It was non-financial support, but nevertheless, it was a commitment to help see this process through. So there is low-hanging fruit to be had. And the question is that we have to start somewhere. And right now we have a very good framework to start with. And just another very quick thought, I think we've always thought of human rights as a thing and of the environment as something else. And very often the work happens in silos. In an example Kavita gave earlier, the right to food security, the right to water, the right to a clean and healthy environment, all of these are human rights. And when considering the impact on the environment, it's absolutely critical to always remember that there is a human rights dimension to it as well. And that's something that is very critical in reflecting, particularly at brand level, because the reporting now requires thought to be given around both sets of impacts and how that might have a financial implication. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. All right, there's a lot of questions. We're going to do our best to get through these. one thing that I want to call out is that there will be a session, a deep dive webinar specifically on the eco-design requirements, which the digital project, digital product passport sort of falls under, and that will be on January 21st. So stay tuned for that one. But I will take some of the questions because I recognize that there are a lot of questions about this. So I will sort of put some of the questions to the group here about it. But I first want to pick up on this comment. I believe it was from Antonio about I agree with transparency, but I insist how questions of data protection and intellectual property will be handled. Giving my secrets for the sake of transparency is, pardon my French, stupid. So as a former garment factory manager, I would agree with you in the sense that when profits and losses are not shared equitably, it is very difficult to share information. And I'll give you a concrete example. You know, if I disclose who my fabric, I was managing a cut and sew factory. So if I disclose who my fabric suppliers are, what's going to stop my brand from going and asking that fabric supplier what their prices are and using that to then negotiate lower prices, using that information against me? Or even worse, taking that fabric supplier and using it to go to a different cut and sew factory. So the reason I say this is because there are a lot of questions in the chat, in the Q&A about data. Which data is going to be required? How do we decide? Who decides which data is going to be required? But the point I think Antonio is making, which I think is a good one to sort of frame this conversation, is that, and actually it's someone from the Sourcery team who said this to me recently, who's one of the entities leading this project. This is not fundamentally a data problem, right? In the sense that, yes, there are going to be requirements about, you know, what kind of information has to be passed along, but every company along the value chain knows who they buy from and who they sell to. The information is there, right? The problem is that we don't want to share it. And why don't we want to share it? Because of the way that these risks and rewards are distributed, and that makes it very difficult to have an open conversation about this. So with that context, I'm going to ask the Remedy Project to share your thoughts on, okay, sorry, the question box keeps scrolling because new questions keep coming in. For the digital product passport, how much information is mandatory and who decides? And related to that, that's a question from Camille. And who will be liable for the data accuracy? And related to that, there's another question from Karen Lindmark about who will set the standard for easy recycled textiles. So I'm going to hand over to the Remedy Project on those questions. And if anyone else from this group wants to jump in, please let me know.
So, as we were saying before, the digital product passport is a requirement set by the eco-design regulation, which will be the topic for webinar number 4. But as of now, so the digital product passport refers to the design requirement of the eco-design regulation. And the requirements will be reparability, reusability, recyclability, the environmental impact for producing, the resources that are needed to produce these textiles, and sustainability parameters in general. The extent of these parameters will be decided by the European Commission, which will provide more guidance on FAQs. And also it will probably relate to other laws on sustainability standards. But we would like to discuss more about that in that webinar.
I'd also like to add a couple of points. Am I interrupting? Did you wanted to answer that first? Archana, did you want to add something?
No, go.
Okay. Okay, so for digital passport, businesses are required to provide detailed information about their products, such as material used, manufacturing processes, and it should be available via digital tags like QR codes or RFID tags. In my perception, the idea of putting DPPs in place is to harmonize all the data that is available. We all agree that today the data is being collected and stored in very fragmented ways. Also, the requirements have been fragmented. Yes, there are discussions within the sector we are taking up with the brands also to harmonize the data requirements, but eventually we will have to comply with uniformity in data collection and presentation, and that will ultimately be fed into carbon calculations and should reflect into very few KPIs regarding social and environmental impact through the QR codes or RFID tags. So the whole concept of DPPs is being implemented to uniform and harmonize how we look at data and how it should be reported only into very key KPIs in the future. Although the reports say that specific requirements for DPPs will be provided in late 2025, but it's important for us to have an adaptive approach. Because if we want to stay competitive, we want to stay ahead of the curve, then we want to explore what is going to be required and explore what needs to be done. So staying in touch with these webinars, staying in touch with the updates that the legislations will be releasing in the coming future, more details will be shared. It will be important for us to meanwhile assess where we stand and find out our own loopholes and gaps.
Thank you.
Just to add to what Ruchita said very, very briefly, with a lot of these laws, including this strategy and the ones we're going to talk about later, it's work in progress. So every now and then there is more information released by the regulator in the form of FAQs or guidance, which really starts to unpack a little bit, what does this mean? Who's responsible for this? How is this going to work? So it really is a process of it's unfolding slowly but surely. The purpose of the strategy is to basically say, here is the direction we are taking. You may as well get ready because this is what's coming down the pipeline.
Thank you. Gori, I see that there's a question or a comment from Claire that you'd like to address.
Yeah, I think it's just to build on the transparency conversation that we were having earlier as to why is there something to hide from suppliers if you're refusing to give some information. I just want to build on that with an example. Because our experience has been that with these upcoming legislations and the requirements around traceability, transparency is being sort of misused in certain cases as a tool, in the sense that some brands will say like, we have these requirements because of traceability, you have to share XYZ data with us. I'll give you an example. Recently, a brand asked for all supply chain data, tier 1 to tier 4, not just of that brands, but all of our data. They were quite persistent about it. And we had to basically kind of dig deeper and understand, why do you need this information? Could you share a note from your leadership, what you're trying to do with the data, what's your data protection policy, all of that. And ultimately, it was just a random request that someone had thought might be important for traceability. So what we are experiencing is, if suppliers question sometimes like, why do you need this data, then sometimes there's that risk of being called non-transparent. Oh, you don't want to share this data with us. Oh, it means you're non-transparent. So what I'm trying to get at is transparency with a certain objective in mind, which doesn't compromise the intellectual property, confidential, competitive advantage sort of data of a supplier is valid, but transparency just for the sake of gathering data, which may be important to someone in a brand, isn't acceptable. So what we found helpful is to sort of ask a lot of questions. Again, we were talking about this earlier. It's okay to ask questions. It's okay to ask, do you have a document about this project? Where is this coming from? Who has initiated it? How will you use the information? I think it's totally valid to ask those questions when someone in a particular brand is asking you to be transparent about whether it's business data or any other data.
Thank you, Gori. We are running out of time, so I'm going to group a couple of the questions together, and I'm actually in parallel going to ask Rubia if you can put the last slide back on the screen which will have which has the QR codes if you'd like to again register for future webinars like the one on digital product passport. But I want to, so I want to group. Let me go back to the questions then. There are a couple of questions about the role of governments in production countries in this picture. And I would like to get the Remedy Project's thoughts on this. You know, what role I mean, we're talking about legislation primarily in the global north, but what role does the government in Bangladesh or in Pakistan or in Cambodia play in this picture? Number one. And then the second question, the second set of questions that I'm going to group together is there are a number of questions on missing data related to life cycle assessment, you know, which certification or module is best for achieving or making sure that you're compliant. Is it the HIG? Is it some other certification? And here, actually, this question I'm not going to hand over to the Remedy Project. I'm just going to say, I think it's not clear. And this is an opportunity for producers, suppliers to come together and to say, how, you know, what should compliance for this piece of legislation look like? And this is where we really hope that this guide inspires producers to come together and to say, hey, this is how we think that the requirements of this particular piece of legislation can be met. And for this group for producers to kind of align on that and come out with a more unified voice on that picture. Okay. The question on national governments for the Remedy Project.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's the million-dollar question, honestly. I mean, in the work that I do, I think the biggest divide I see is the fact that suppliers are asked to comply with what are essentially international standards that are encapsulated in supplier codes of conduct, etc., handed down by brands. However, the reality on the ground is, you know, local laws, local legislation, local norms are far from international standards. And there is always that huge gap in terms of the environment and ecosystem within which suppliers are operating. Whether it goes from minimum wage to the idea of a living wage, whether it is freedom of association, etc. Many of these are things suppliers don't control. And one of the interesting things with all of this wave of legislation sweeping the global north is, if I take a look at Southeast Asia and I look at, you know, what have states or how have states been reacting, there hasn't been much of a reaction, actually. And there hasn't been much of the state stepping up to say, actually, our businesses are going to be in a very vulnerable position with all of these demands coming down the pipeline from buyers. Here's how we might want to think about supporting them. There have been a lot of conversations around supporting SMEs in places like Malaysia, in Thailand, but no material sort of, you know, changes have been seen as such. There is still a reliance on what will be handed down by brands towards towards suppliers in order to make a lot of this possible. So if I was to sum it up in a statement, it would be very much this, that states in production countries were not consulted or engaged with in any of the development of these pieces of legislation. They came as an afterthought, as many suppliers did too. And when it comes to sanction policies, I think, you know, we have, for example, the US Customs and Border Protection, WROs to go by. Some of them do translate into impact for communities on the ground. Many of them don't. It's just another pushing back of responsibilities as well. So it would be good to see states step up a lot more and be a lot more for the businesses that are operating on their territory, but we have yet to see them really step up. We've seen governments like in Japan, for example, put out various guidelines around business and human rights. Again, they're voluntary guidelines. So the response has been primarily voluntary. Standards, you know, it's up to you how you do it, how well you do it, how poorly you do it, but nothing mandatory or nothing of the sort of leveling up the field or providing support.
Thank you. we are out of time. I know there's still a lot of unanswered questions in the chat, and I want to thank you for putting those questions in. I think we're going to have a conversation internally about how we might provide answers to some of these questions, and whether to you personally or in sort of a collective format, in the sense that we have a lot of the same questions coming up. Maybe it's worth putting out responses to this. I don't know. We need to have a conversation about internally. But I encourage you, if there are any questions that you haven't put in the chat, please put them in, because it's useful for us to figure out how we continue to evolve these webinars and make them as useful for you as possible. And with that, I would like to thank everybody here for sharing your thoughts today. I'd especially like to thank all of the suppliers for supporting or leading on this piece of work together with the Remedy Project. And my final sort of call to action to you would be, as a group of suppliers, we have to organize. We have to say, we have to take the lead in saying, this is how this piece of legislation should be interpreted, and this is how we think you as a brand, what you should do to be compliant. We have to organize in terms of having this conversation with governments in the countries that we operate, and we have to organize in terms of having these conversations with brands also around price, because this is not something that one manufacturer and one brand, this is not a conversation they can have. The only way we will succeed on this is if we work collectively. So with that, I really encourage you to come next time. I encourage you to submit your questions. We will think about how we can structure these sessions in a way that is most useful to you. And thank you very much for giving us a piece of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.